Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce our panelists first, and then they're each going to give sort of a brief overview of their work. And then we'll enter into a little discussion. And then I want to allow a lot of time for you to ask them questions, because I think that's probably the most important part of having this kind of conversation. So that is how we will be. I'm going to start down here with Herve. Dr. Tchumkam, as a world language professor, holds degrees from the University Sorbonne Nouvelle Paris III, and my French is terrible, so I apologize for that, and the University of Pennsylvania. A trained comparativist, his fields of interest range from post-colonial studies and literary theory to political philosophy. His publications include numerous essays and book chapters on contemporary fiction and politics, with a connection to former French colonies, including hexagonal France, the Caribbean, and North Africa. He's also one of our Altschuler recipients. Next is Constantin Icleanu. Dr. Icleanu joined World Languages and Literature in fall 2017. He specializes in 20th and 21st century Latin American literature and cinema, with an emphasis in migration and transnational studies. His scholarship seeks to better the portrayal of immigrants in mass media through the study of literature, film, and music about immigration. He's also joined us as a faculty affiliate during the spring 2023 semester. Next is Dr. Engel. He's founding director of the SMU Center for Presidential History. He's taught American history, international relations, and grand strategy at the University of Wisconsin, Yale University, the University of Pennsylvania, and Haverford College. He's a recipient of numerous teaching awards and has authored or edited 13 books on American foreign policy. He's also a frequent contributor on international and political affairs for media such as CNN, NPR, and BBC. In 2019, the Residence Life students named him their university-wide Pope Professor of the Year. I hope you all know how much I am condensing the bios of the folks with us. So, and finally, there's Amy Richardson. She is a clinical associate professor in the Simmons School Department of Teaching and Learning. She's also director of preparation and scholarship of teaching. Prior to earning her doctorate in educational leadership from SMU, she was a secondary social studies and English teacher. Her areas of expertise also includes the use of technology, specifically mixed reality simulations, to support higher learning and development. She's currently working on a project with colleagues in Georgia and California to develop a pedagogy for navigating controversy in the classroom. So I think we're well represented to have this conversation. I'll start with Herve down at the end of the table. If you would just give sort of a 5-minute overview of your courses. And
well, thank you, Karen. My courses, I would say, that's at the intersection of critical race studies, human rights, and political philosophy. Strangely enough, I just came out of a class, Jan term, on the failure of humanity in Rwanda. That looks at the sociological, political, and historical conditions of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. Other classes vary from post-colonial France, a class on the African diaspora in France, to a class on the French Muslim citizens and the Algerian war, with a special focus on the Harkis, being those Algerians who sided with the French at the time of decolonization against their own compatriots. At the graduate level, for the liberal studies, I teach global insecurity, the human condition in Africa, and quite on a routine base, critical methods and cultures. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Constantine.
My name is Constantin Icleanu, and come from an interesting background. I'm from Romania, and when I was born, Romania was communist at the time. We had a dictatorship in power, and we didn't have very many freedoms. And I lived through this experience of violent revolution and changing government, anarchy, and then back to a normal situation where Romania is now, and it's doing a lot better. This has pushed me in many ways. In some ways with my own feelings about my own country being very low and desiring to immigrate myself somewhere else. I made it here to America, and I went to school, and I kept going to school because I don't know why, but here I am.
Yeah.
I ended up with a PhD from the University of Kentucky, and my dissertation was on the study of empathy. It was called A Case for Empathy in literature, film, and music, as well as political speech from authors that represented North Africa, Eastern Europe, obviously Romania, and Latin America in Spain. So my focus is actually not Latin America. I use Latin American authors and things, but in the context of how people are received in Spain and according to their immigration policies, but not just their policies, but the representation of those immigrants in the media. So how does the media represent people? And then how do laws use that representation to advance certain kinds of policies for or against immigration? The courses I teach here at SMU are fairly basic. As I'm a senior lecturer, I teach language courses, but I also teach a film course, and the film is, it's a film course on immigration to Spain from these special areas that I just mentioned, Eastern Europe, North Africa, and Latin America. And it discusses with students how these immigrants are received by the audiences and how they're represented by the directors, which are 100% of them are Spanish. So we're talking about a discourse that is created by a native Spaniard or a person born in Spain of Spanish heritage, talking about other people's experience into their land, and how oftentimes, even though they put forth very positive portrayals of these immigrants, they're actually fairly negative because they take away agency of the people, and they often use empathy as a tool that is unfair. Anyway, which it's interesting because it creates positive views in some aspects, but other parts of the population take it in a very poor way. So it creates division in society rather than unity. The other class I teach that's related to this panel is a class on convivencia, which means living together in Spain between the Jewish population, Muslim and Christian. And it deals with medieval times all the way to modern times, and we skip stuff in the middle because we want to look how in medieval times they coexisted and how nowadays they're actually having a much harder time, which is very confusing to our students, but it brings in very interesting conversations. And I'll stop there.
Yes.
Cool. Hi, I'm Jeffrey Engel. I'm a historian by training. I work in U.S. foreign policy as my background, but of course that's devolved into looking at the presidency. And I should point out that you're laughing already, yeah. Our center first started in 2012 at SMU. Right around 2015, people stopped asking why we should study the president. It seems self-evident. And I am the guy at the table who does the thing that you're not supposed to do. As to say, we're trained that we're not supposed to talk about religion, we're not supposed to talk about money, we're not supposed to talk about politics. That's my life. I teach courses on U.S. foreign policy and grand strategy, which has a lot to do with it. Actually, it's all about teaching empathy, to be honest. And also a course on presidents at war. And interesting way that course developed, actually. It was the first actual lecture course the history department, I think, ever offered. Designed for first and second year students, designed to generate more interest in the history major. And we wanted to make it something that was interesting. So I sat down with the department chair and said, here are the things I could do. I could teach foreign policy. I could teach military history. I could teach history of the presidency. At which point my wife, who's also on the faculty here at SMU, walks in the room and says, "You guys are idiots. The answer is right in front of you, presidents at war." And what's great about that title is that it lets us talk about anything. And if there is a difficult topic circulating through American politics at this moment, I guarantee we're going to not just run into it, but smash into it. And I take the approach that for many of my students, maybe even most of my students, unfortunately, mine is the only history class they're ever going to take. So I want to make sure by the time they're done, not only do they know who won World War II, but you'd be surprised. But basic things like what is, the Civil Rights Act? What is the Voting Rights Act? Why do we have a Food and Drug Administration? Things you wouldn't necessarily think would come up in a strictly foreign policy course. I try to integrate because I want the course to be as much about civics as anything else, that they should become a better citizen when you're done. And the primary takeaway that I want the students to have, which I'm sure we'll get into time and time again in this conversation, is an ability to recognize how to talk to each other without fighting with each other, which of course starts with listening to each other. And that's something which I'd like to focus on as we go forward.
I might like to call your wife to help title our courses, Teaching and Learning. My name is Amy Richardson. I'm the Director of Teacher Preparation and also Clinical Faculty in the Department of Teaching and Learning across the street in Simmons. And the reason I'm here is I teach pre-service English, language arts, and social studies teachers methods. There are two particular methods courses which are poorly named, so we won't bother with that. Like content, methods, and differentiated instruction, which isn't really descriptive of what we're doing. But the reason I'm here on this panel today is that my work is to teach them how to get kids to talk to each other. And over time, throughout my whole career, I've just realized the way that we get kids to talk is that we give them interesting things to talk about. And the interesting things are always hard and controversial. So, yeah. And so I'm in kind of a different place than you all, in that I'm helping people who are new to the profession or about to go into the profession try it out and help them. And I mean, maybe an interesting and often stressful part of what we deal with is the external politics of schools, which is extra hard right now, especially when it comes to social studies and reading, which adds a layer too. So there are times in which in our work, like I might know the right thing for our teachers to do. And then we also have this really complicated political environment that our teachers are teaching in. We have to kind of think about how do we do the right thing and not get fired or get on the news in a bad way, not in a good way like you are.
I'm only on the news if something bad has happened.
Oh, okay. But you're not bad. Yeah.
I don't guess.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and I have had, and when I was a teacher in New Jersey, did have a colleague who did make it on the news for a great instructional choice that they made, actually. So like, I can totally speak to that. But I think that's a broad kind of overview. So like seated in actually the course I'm about to teach, we run a simulation in the immersion lab with Avatar kids, where my teachers are actually teaching a lesson about the Dobbs decision. And I can explain to you why my research group made that choice. I understand it's like not something that's actionable in a public school right now. Fully get that. But we like have landed on that because it just provides some important utility to us. But my teachers work on with strong materials that we give them, how to get kids to talk about case briefs and not go off the rails or hurt each other. Yeah, so how to get an instructional task done while maintaining our community. So then I could talk more about that forever.
Sure. Let's maybe start with when you know that you're going to be handling a controversial subject or concept in your classes. what do you do to plan for that? Or how do you plan for those discussions?
I'll go. From day one is the first answer. And let me preface, I was thinking about what I wanted to say to you this afternoon, and I realized I need to preface everything I'm going to say with the following, which is if we're talking about teacher and teaching techniques, I come into the classroom with frankly, with a whole lot of privilege. I'm a white guy, I've got gray hair, I always wear a suit, students don't mess with me on average. So, and I need to put that out there. So some of the things which I say might work for me, but might be more difficult for other people. But I established from the very first day that we're going to argue and that we're also going to be really uncomfortable. I mean, the idea of having a trigger warning course message for a course about warfare is oxymoronic in some ways, I guess. And so I give the following speech to students every year. President Turner hates this speech, by the way, which makes it more enjoyable to give. I explain to them, first and second year students, I explain to them that they are now not in high school anymore, that they're in college. Fundamental difference between college and high school is that everybody you've engaged up until this point is invested in your achievement. That's say, if you don't achieve, you don't do well on your scores, the coach gets fired, or on the field, coach gets fired. Teacher, high school teacher, their students don't perform, they get fired. I have tenure. I'm not getting fired. And more importantly, and here's the kicker, I get paid whether they learn or not. And what that does, I think, is establish from the beginning that you are an adult and that you are a professional student. And therefore you will treat this with respect and treat everyone else with respect, because if you don't want to learn or if you don't want to participate, I'm not laying up nights about it. In truth, I do, but I don't want them to know that. And so the idea is to try to establish from the very beginning that we are going to treat each other like adults and like professionals, and we're gonna argue about really uncomfortable things. And if you are uncomfortable, I'm doing my job right. So whenever then a subsequent topic comes up, I can refer back to the first day and say, remember, I promised you were going to be uncomfortable. Here's a moment where some of you might be.
Are there boundaries around that in terms of this is how we will talk to each other or not talk to each other? Do you specify?
Yes, but I don't do it. I think I like to model, first of all, respectful conversation. We have a lot, even though it's a lecture class I teach, we have a lot of interaction back and forth as much as possible, all random, by the way. We have a Socratic method of calling on people in our class because there's 180 kids. So I will turn to the TA and when I have a question and say, give me a name, and they'll give me a name. And sometimes the questions are as difficult as, how was your weekend? And sometimes they're as difficult as, what do you think about President Roosevelt's decision here? And by respectfully engaging them, I think I make the example of here's how I want you to react back to me. And then by implication, how you react to each other. And again, I think here is where my position in society comes in. I can shut somebody down really easily if they're being disrespectful and they listen to me. I know that's not always the case for everybody at the front of the classroom, but by jumping on what I consider to be out of bounds conversation, which doesn't happen all that often, I can nip it in the bud because I'm engaging and modeling.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone have a different approach to that, or what do you do when you are challenged?
I mean, mine is totally different. That like we
That's
teach
good.
in totally different environments, but I think part of it is because of what I'm pitching my people in to do. But all that we're teaching our pre-service teachers in the beginning of throughout their whole experience with us, but definitely in these two courses that I teach, the foundation of it is community, our classroom community first. Like we need to know each other. Like I need to get to know them. And I'm really intentional too, and sometimes kind of meta about what I'm doing because I'm like trying to model to them what I want them to do when they go to teach in their secondary classroom. But we need to know about each other and show each other some level of respect and care. And we need to model, like we actually practice how we talk to each other, because, and I know that would be so awkward in your classroom, right? Because they are college students and they probably should know, but I'm working with people who are going back to a 7th grade classroom, and I'll say like, do a cooperative group. And prior to actually doing this, I'd say like, oh, do this cooperative group activity. And they come back the next week and they're like, well, you're a lying liar. Like my kids won't talk to each other. And so like we backed up into like, okay, we're gonna model this cooperative grouping strategy. And like, if you're stuck, like on the board are going to be some sentence starters. Like, this is what I need my group to talk about. And so I'll actually do that with my students. Like, okay, talk in your small groups. Here's some sentence starters. If you're tired, you've had a long day, whatever. So like we model how we treat each other all along the way. But as I'm pitching into the harder part, my class isn't all like hard hitting controversial conversation. But as I'm pitching into that, I'm like letting them know what's coming. So class starts for me next on Tuesday. And by week 2, I'll begin to let them know, okay, like actually in March, we're going to do this simulation. The simulation does relate to Dobbs and abortion. And I'm going to do everything I can to get us in a place where we are comfortable doing this. And I'll explain to you really carefully what we're going to do. They'll watch videos of what it's like to work with the avatar. I'm going to give them model lesson plans, but I also always leave open the possibility. And actually the last time I taught this, I had a student with a real life situation that was that was dealing with abortion while we were doing the simulation. And they came to me and they're like, I can't. And of course not. Like, we will do an alternate assignment. And that is what I'm modeling to them, what they should absolutely be doing with their kids when they're a high school teacher too. So, but in terms of respectful conversation, like I try to craft, like the work that they're doing is like, it's actually meant to, they're teaching kids who are voiced by an actress. I don't know if you all know about the Immersion Lab. I'd love to have you over. It's so awesome. This amazing actress named Stacey Ann who works in Simmons. And part of her job is actually, we create situations where the kids will pop up and say things, or they'll relate to the content, so that my teachers have to go like, oh my God, like Ava's mom, Ava's mom terminated a pregnancy. And that is like actually not what we're talking about right now. The technology allows my teachers to pause the classroom and turn around and go, holy mackerel, what do I do? And then, but we've also kind of talked about that beforehand. But actually the whole point is like to have these uncomfortable moments. And then also the whole point is we've designed this lesson so we can say to Ava, like, whoa, that's a lot. That's hard. It sounds like this content is just really, really meshing, like you're having a personal experience with that. And, there are a variety of ways we might deal with that student, but we'll also move back to the work in hand, which is actually not to talk about that personal experience. It's to talk about a case brief. So, and and frankly, and anytime we run a controversial simulation with students, it's all about like, we're talking about an issue. Kids will, like high school or middle school kids will relate to things like we want them to, acknowledging that, figuring out how to deal with it in the moment, and then move back to like the issue at hand, which is the content, which is not your personal experience actually, which also matters. I'll stop talking. Yeah.
You're dealing with students who actually are maybe doing this.
Yeah.
I was just going to say in my classes, so I share some of your privileges, but also not, right? As an immigrant myself. So in some way, like what we do in my course, the film course, I usually tell my students, there are no trigger warnings per se, but there's a statement in the syllabus that tells students that they need to be respectful, and that we discuss in my course politics on both the left and the right, and they're very well represented by political philosophy and academics. And I tell them that both of these different diverging views are acceptable, and whichever your political inclination may be, that's fine, but please use academic arguments and not fear-based and fear-mongering in the class. So I do not allow those kinds of comments, but I do allow my students, and they usually feel really well when they know that the class is not there to just kind of brainwash them into one specific point of view, and that they can maintain whatever political view they have, but this time in our conversation, base it on facts and, academic type discourse. That has helped me a lot. The other thing that I do in my class, and I feel a little bit cowardish about it because I address these challenges not head on, but kind of from the side. And why I say that is because we study all these cases in Spain. So we'll have an immigrant and he or she comes from, I don't know, let's pick a country like the Dominican Republic. She ends up in Spain and deals with all this discrimination. And the students can judge this situation from an outsider's point of view rather than I'm the one that's discriminating against this woman.
Right.
Which makes it so they themselves can judge a situation in a way that doesn't affect them. It's like, oh yeah, these Spanish people, they're the racists, right? When in reality, the movie's showing how we may be those people, but they're not seeing it that way, and they're able to make decisions and ethical responses to these films from an outsider's perspective, looking into something else. And then later in the class, we bring it home and we say, we are these people. How would you treat this guy if he were here? And then the situation becomes very different and very interesting. But when I model the discussions from this other point of view, oh, this is happening in a different country, I get very, very honest and good responses without the political chasm between the aisles and everybody feeling like they're stepping on minefields.
Yeah, I have a quite similar but different experience. Being a minority, having an accent, and a last name that nobody can pronounce, I make it clear from the get-go, You're walking into a humanities/human rights class. If you can't handle these discussions, please leave. There are other classes that meet these requirements. So if you walk in here, you can't handle them, leave. So that was the very beginning. But my whole philosophy changed because my second or third year at SMU, I had a student who came to me at the end of the semester and said that if I was white, maybe like Jeffrey, if I was a white guy teaching the same thing that I teach, they wouldn't get as offended. And for me, it was completely revealing, So one of the things that I do, and I know maybe the provost is gonna hate me for this, I tell them, if you can't handle the conversation, leave the class. That's the first thing. The other thing is that I start very brutally. I tell them what I'm teaching you. I'm not teaching you what to think. I'm teaching you how to think. And one thing that's central, as I emphasize this to students, is that I don't expect pity or empathy. Or speaking of empathy, because I think if you start with pity, then you are disqualifying the basic dignity of humans. I just came out of a Rwanda class, and kids cry and stuff, which is fine, right? However, I make it clear that if the only reaction to this is pity, then you're not moving forward. Absolutely not. Because all what you're doing is you resorting to affect instead of to the reason, right? So there are many circumstances where I've reacted in very different ways, but for particular reasons, because I belong to those so-called minority groups. I remember, mentioned this to Karen once, a kid who told me that slavery wasn't a human rights issue. It was just about business. Yeah, beautiful. And
it's just business, don't you?
Yeah, no, I wasn't offended. So the reaction of students were pretty much, no, he should leave the class. And I told them no. If he leaves the class, then we are not at the university. We are here to debate these ideas. I will be ready to concede that it was just business if you're ready to concede that those people were not humans. And then he started thinking. And then I moved forward by asking, and guys, I'm very brutal. I was like, were there white poor people in America? He said yes. The next question was, do you know how far Africa is? The answer was yes. And I was like, so why would they give themselves all the pain going all the way to Africa by boat when they could just enslave white people here? And then that completely changed. And I'm proud that that student, you won't believe it, has gone to Oxford to do international law because they say now he wants to defend people who have been made invisible. So I think it completely changed its perspective. But I just have to say that, you know, those difficult discussions need to happen. And thank God SMU gave me the best pretext. When I say what I say, I tell them, you can go sue me, you can go talk to the president. I'm contributing to changing world shapers. That's all I do. So what I do aligns very much with what SMU wants. And like Jeffrey, sometimes I say, unfortunately for you, I don't care what you write in the recommendations, nothing's gonna happen to me. So it's a mix of seriousness, but also jokes at times, to help them understand mostly what I think, I will call it radical equality, you know. And it's very challenging at SMU. By the way, I'm very glad I'm here. For the first 3 years, I didn't know I was going to stay here, but I finally thought this is where the battle has to go. Building on what a colleague at Princeton usually says, that imperial mythology has to be confronted on its home ground. And that's what guides my teaching in general. I don't shy from these difficult discussions, but I reassure students. I tell them I bark, but I don't bite. Don't worry. So nothing is going to happen to you. Basically, it falls really on that emphasis, you know. I want an ethical responsibility, ethical engagement with the issues we're discussing. I'm not expecting pity, you know, because when it's affect, then you are dismissing the dignity of the humans that we are looking at. And Jeffrey, it's fun because Jeffrey mentioned presidential wars and stuff. One of the reasons, which I argue, one of the reasons why I have a job is that there are a lot of stupid people out there. Stupid in the sense that they are always lesser people, you know. And using human rights, the human rights program, there is no such thing as a lesser person. My most important challenge in class is to get them to understand that we all members of humanity. And the easiest trick that I've used most of the time is to tell them, for example, that by being insensitive to the insecurity that happens outside in the world, we are unwittingly inviting that insecurity in our own home. You know, they don't get it, but you just look at migration crisis. Why are people migrating? Why are people leaving the richest places on earth to rush to Europe or to America? There is certainly a reason why. So, and then I let them figure out the reason, which they usually do by the end of the semester. So, broadly put, yeah, those are some of the ways I address it. Conscious that I don't have the same privileges as Jeffrey, I just go head on, you know. I don't shy anyway. If you do post-colonial studies and you shy from those type of discussions, then you're not doing it.
Yes, but
I was hoping it'd be okay to take questions on the floor. I'm wondering how you deal with all four of you, or whoever wants to talk, with students who are now afraid to speak out their minds in class because they are afraid of being attacked.
that was one of my questions.
And not even by the teacher, but by their fellow students.
Beth, if I may go at it, I would say, I don't know, but it rarely happens in my classes because I speak my mind exactly the way it is, you know. You might find it as a joke, but I start by telling them I'm not here for affirmative action. I'm not here to check a box. I'm not a black token, you know. That's why I start. So when you start that brutally, at least in my experience, the students I have, they know the type of openness that I have of being candid. I'm so candid that usually they don't refrain from speaking their minds, even when they disagree. And that's the whole point. To that emphasis, I always tell them, I need objections. I know you're not lawyers, but I need objections, because only 3 objections, I'm going to be better as a teacher. And every discussion is accepted in my classes as long as you convince me. So don't just answer because you don't like who said it. Attack the message, not the messenger. That's how I frame it. And if you are able to unpack the message and, you know, provide a sound rebuttal, I'll be ready to follow you. So I just create an atmosphere whereby by being straightforward and fully honest. No, my students, I don't have those issues, strangely enough, you know.
So I just to clarify, they know where your position politically.
Yeah, they know. And I tell them, my only political party is human. And I tell, you know, the joke, I use disadvantages and advantages. I tell them not being American. I don't have to align Democrats or Republican. I don't care. I'm just human. So whatever is your stance, as long as what matters in this class is the value that's affected to the human, we are on the same boat.
Thank you.
I actually do something very similar, where I don't usually have problems. And I think one of the best things you can do is to trust your students. I have some colleagues that approach teaching from this position of either they don't know anything and I need to teach them everything, or they're afraid of what situations can come up in their class. I think the best policy is to just trust your students, model appropriate conversation behavior, and then your students will live up to that. And very, very seldomly have I had somebody that's just like starts spouting some nonsense. But it's all about, you know, giving them good readings, allowing the readings to speak to them, to challenge them and to speak to them at the same time, and understanding how a reading that challenges their opinions at home, when we come to class and we explain it, they can see, oh, I can see how some people would find that attractive. Or if I were in professor's shoes as an immigrant, I too would feel this way. Or if I were that person at the border, something, right? So, but to me personally, the most important thing is trusting your students, allowing them to be mature and to accept their points of view, and then discussing and working with them. That to me has been very advantageous, and I've almost never had any issues where people are just rude or, problematic, disruptive.
I haven't had that. I've had students tell me, well, I'm scared to say anything because I don't want someone to attack me, which is a little different.
Well, one thing we can do, so I work with people who work with younger people. Like, that's a problem in middle and high school, right? Kids don't want to talk. And so one thing we can do, I mean, I use it in my own classes, you might give a variety of ways for students to respond, because discussion doesn't work for everybody, right? And I know, like, it's always what I'm driving towards. Like, it's where I feel like it's where you kind of get your money's worth around here, is a good academic discussion. But also some people just aren't gonna, for a variety of reasons, and it might depend on the day, like, just aren't gonna be able to contribute like in the moment. I mean, so maybe there's a written response. Maybe they can talk to a shoulder partner first, and then that pair has the opportunity to share either thing. And I mean, I'm teaching pedagogy, so I'm teaching that to my students, but also, I mean, you could tell your students, like, you know, like, we all have a bad day, and maybe your partner said something really amazing, like, lift them up, like, share that. That helps your community too, right? And then when you want to have the hard conversation, like, then we're building each other up, and we're trusting each other more if we, But I think, like, Yeah, and I guess if you have something that's so scary to them that they don't want to talk, it might be time to like kind of consider your approach, like what you're talking about too. Like if they just don't want to talk. I mean, when that has happened to me, I might stop and say like, what's going on? Like, yeah, like how could we do this differently? Like, why are we uncomfortable with this? Yeah.
I just want to address your question as a follow-up. I have students that I love this film course because I get students from all sorts of backgrounds. In my normal Spanish classes, they're very typical, what you think of an SMU student, wealthy, white, whatever. In my immigration course, I get a lot of variety of people, and it's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes people are afraid because they usually come from a poor background. Maybe their parents were not regular immigrants, right? They didn't have papers. And at first they're like, they don't want because they feel ashamed of that. And I know that shame because I felt it as a, third world country, Romanian, Eastern European, right? That's always been pushed on me, and I hated that, and I still do. I feel it's so horrible, but whatever. Anyway, I've learned to live with it. And I know that my students have some of those self-shame because of their certain backgrounds and things. And it is the most wonderful thing when they come out in a way and they say things like, my mom was in this situation. She traveled on a tire tube across the river and did these things, and we are here now. And so like, I don't know how to say it beyond, just trusting
How do
your
you get them
students.
to say that? I'm sorry, do you mind? Because that's the juice. Like, how do you get them to say that?
For me, it's the academic readings plus the films. And in the films, they get these views and they get empathy / pity about these people. But when we converse in the class, and I usually try to move them away from the ideological message of the film, which is this usual pity / empathy, which empathy is not always bad, but it can be used to manipulate people. And oftentimes in film, it is used as a tool to manipulate for a purpose. Students find that interesting, and they usually fall for it. And we, in class, try to discuss better solutions or better ways of representing immigrants. And usually students in those situations, when they find themselves in a, how do you call this, amenable environment where students in the class understand and they don't judge people because they've immigrated irregularly, then these other students feel like, I want to share my experience. And it is the best experience of my life whenever we get students sharing those kinds of things from their different backgrounds. It's really wonderful, but it takes some time. It's not an easy thing. It's just, they have to learn to trust you and trust the class and building that environment.
I have one question for you. There are times that things pop up in classes that aren't focused on the topics, right? Particularly out of like, political, cultural kinds of things. And some of us don't have the same expertise and comfort that you all have developed in your courses and being able to create that environment where those discussions can happen. And then the other thing that happens is students will go from class to class to class, and somebody will try to take that on. And by the end of the day, they're exhausted about talking about a particular subject. I'm thinking of George Floyd in particular in terms of how that happened. So I wondered what advice you could offer in terms of how having to deal with those unexpected moments, hot moments that pop up that just catch you off guard. It's not necessarily your expertise. And a lot of times you're having your own emotions about something that you haven't quite sorted out either. So what is the best strategy at that point?
Yeah. I think if you're uncomfortable with the topic, you probably shouldn't address it. And I say that because if you're in an emotional state yourself, your students are also in shock about something, those conversations are probably not going to be the most productive conversations. And you can just tell honestly to your students, this is impacting me emotionally, and I'd rather not discuss this now. Personally, when students come up with those kinds of things in class, I always address them, because the most unsatisfactory answer I have ever gotten in a classroom situation is when somebody's like, that's not part of the class. ignore you. I personally don't like that, but I think that there is a time and a place for it. If you're not up to it, I don't think that you should engage with it. It may just be more simple.
And there's this like in between space. And I mean, I tell a lot of my new teachers this because sometimes they'll have an opportunity and in the moment they're thinking, yeah, like we should do something about that. And I could do something about that. And I can't do it right now, but maybe tomorrow. And so it's like, yeah, say that thing. Say, whoa, yeah, the insurrection is huge. And we should absolutely talk about it. And we have never had an insurrection before, and I need 24 hours. And I will, BRB. And in the meantime too, like if there's something you need from this, like meet me after school. So like, and it could even be like in our context, like in the next class or two, we will make space. Email me if you need to talk about it or if you have a feeling about it. Yeah.
2 points. I do spend a considerable amount of time at the beginning of the semester because invariably things are going to come up that are going to be relevant to what we're talking about and uncomfortable, hopefully. I spend some time talking about the fact that our society, big statement, our society has conflated bias with conclusion. And I tell the students, a bias is what you have when you begin entering a discussion or an investigation, and a thoughtful conclusion is after you've thought about it. So when something like George Floyd or when something like the October 7th in Israel arises, I can stop and say, okay, you don't have to raise your hand, but think about raising your hand. Are you on this side of the issue? Are you on that side of the issue? Why? And what do you actually know about that issue? And I actually really like doing this with SMU alumni because they have a longer historical memory, if you will. My favorite example is to go to a group, and this works better again with adults, and say, y'all remember the non-proliferation treaty with Iran that President Obama negotiated and President Trump got rid of. Who here thinks it's a good deal? And if you raise your hand and think it's a good deal, that means you're a Democrat. And if you raise your hand and think it's a bad deal, that means you're a Republican. And then I say, okay, what's on page 7 of the treaty? Because nobody in the room has read it. Nobody. But they say, well, how do you know that you're in favor of it? And if the only answer is because my political allegiance says I should be, that's not a great answer. That's a bias. Let's start with trying to figure out how you can get there yourself. The other thing, just to make one smaller point on the fact that I do rigorously, spontaneously call on people. I do tell the students, and I've gotten better about this, I think, as the years have gone on, as I've aged in the classroom. I tell the students at the very beginning and then reiterate over class, if something comes up in your life and you're going to miss class and you know it, tell the TA. If there's something that's going to make you not want to answer today, just don't even need a reason. Just tell the TA. Because I'm turning to the way I do it. I'm turning to the TAs and say, give me a name. If they've already crossed off 3 names because those students have said, I'm sorry, I'm sick, or I'm sorry, my grandmother died. It's amazing how dangerous it is to be a grandparent around midterms.
45 grandparents, one family.
Then I won't call on them. But other than that, if you're paying attention, you should be able to have an opinion on this. Not an opinion, a thoughtful response.
Like, do you ever have students though who you'll ask a hard question and they'll say honestly, like, I am overwhelmed by this, or like I'm thinking this, but also like, is that acceptable to you?
It's acceptable that they say it. I don't accept it
It's
as a
not
final
what you
answer.
want.
No.
Okay.
Well, and so I try to. My theory of teaching is break everything down to the easiest component. I think that's also the way I understand the world. I'm a pretty simplistic person. So around lecture 4, I think, I give them my theory, which is not a theory, it's reality, that nothing that happens in international relations, you don't already know if you've been to a bar. That basically, one person is jealous of another, one person might bump into another, so on and so forth. Every example can come back to something that you in your own life have actually seen. So if the response is, I don't know, I'm overwhelmed, I'll say, okay, well, what would you do if someone attacked your home? We try to make it basic as possible.
Right.
And until they're sort of forced to realize that they have to give an answer. And the only time I don't have patience is if it's clear that the students are not. No, I don't care about the parent. They're not prepared anyway. Not paying attention.
Oh.
I had a student once when we called on him. It was great. We called on him, no answer. I called again, no answer. I said, okay, we'll move on to the next student. And I see there's a rumbling in the back. And one student's like elbowing the other. And I said, are you Bob Smith? And the student stares at me. Are you Bob Smith? He stares at me. And then he slowly takes down his hoodie and takes off his massive headphones and says, what? And I think I actually said, I'm fucking done. But that too models, I think, perhaps I shouldn't have cursed, but that models that, if you're not going to be a professional, you're not even engaged in the discussion.
I have one last woo-woo.
I think there's a.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I miss it? Yeah, that's okay.
Actually, I just reminded you of an activity I do in my classes for our international students, just to get them talking so we can assist with English communications, but it's team debates. And I was interested when you mentioned, identifying students' positions or opinions, and wondering if you ever require that they take the opposite side, research side. So in these debates, the students suggest topics, and then they vote on and choose the topics. But then they're not assigned to the side, and they have to choose a side. They have to research both sides, knowing that I might let them have the side they want. I might let them pick their side, and then I'll switch them. Or it could go in any direction, but they often do come away from that with a lot more understanding of issues that we're interested in talking about than when we just get to talk about the community.
I think that's a marvelous and useful technique. And as I try to present the different debates that went on in American history, I try as much as possible, as humanly possible, to present each side evenly. Say you can disagree with the conclusion, but let's understand what their argument was. Even the people who talk about slavery, we can't have a useful conversation about slavery if we don't understand what the slaveholders were thinking. We don't have to agree with it, but let's understand it. And I don't have opportunity in this lecture class to get into those kind of debates, but when I teach my strategy course, I have the students write papers explaining, and not just explaining, but advocating for the rationale of different policymakers. Why do they think this? Why do they think this is going to work? What were they going for? What was their ideal? And it's not that bad when you do Alexander the Great. And when you get to Hitler, then that starts to, which by the way, I go chronologically, so that's later. So we've seen a modeling of people having to take a position that you don't need to agree with Napoleon to understand what he was going for. And frankly, you don't need to agree with Hitler to understand he had aims. Say what you will about the guy, he had a plan. So what's the plan? And if you can advocate the plan, maybe not advocate being the ultimate best word for Hitler, but articulate the plan, then you're really understanding it.
No.
To your point, and I think it's very important. I think it was February 25th, 2022, how I remember, because war with Ukraine started on May 4th. And I'm from the third country, I'm from Eastern Europe. I took it 20 years ago. I came to class and I told the students, I said on the back of their auditorium, not just volume, and I said, I can't teach the class. I still remember that, so I'm sort of like worried right now. I'm not from Ukraine, from Belarus, but it's kind of the same. Third countries, whatever. So, you know what? It changed. The cool thing, it changed my teaching, because I think what showing students, oh, I'm sorry. Showing we can be vulnerable. It's also fine. I'm not saying that emotions every time. No. And I put myself and I just like taught the class without, other topics, not switching to them. It's not that I'm uncomfortable because I need to teach the subject. It's not a historical, it's operations management. It's kind of like has nothing to do with politics or religious or anything, though it does because it's life. But the students, they send me some messages and they really like said, oh, we changed everything. Thank you for being honest with us. And I mean, I'm not saying that, I do those times, but sometimes I see them those little things like, oh, by the way, I started running 6 years ago and I already ran Boston 3 times. And they're like, what? I mean, it's not that I'm bragging about it, yes. You would say, yes, you are in the class, but we'll run 4. I'm not gonna say that.
Yeah.
Just to the point that like we all humans, we can have hobbies, we can have fun, go to the subject, but also just, I don't know, be open with them.
Your community.
It's very fine border, how much you want to reveal, how much not. My Instagram profile is closed. So, I mean, I'm just,
Then how are we supposed to see the pictures of you running?
send me in the back.
Karen, it's
So,
just,
vulnerability and just being like sometimes yourself and not being afraid of to show them emotions.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to bring those difficult subjects like to place. Like they can see each other differently. Sorry,
No, absolutely.
Thank you.
Any other questions we have
We
about?
got Herve.
I was
Oh,
just gonna say, very quickly that I find the conversation very interesting, You guys have to jump a hurdle to establish something. I don't. I work in the class, they see me, I already personify that, and I don't have that, you know what I'm saying?
I do know.
I don't have to negotiate that.
Yeah.
Because from the moment, I have an accent, and as I love to remind my American students, you have an accent too, Yeah, I love your accent. I adore yours. How come? How do I have an accent? I'm like, oh, sure, you do. But I don't have to. I really don't have. And maybe, so my identity and what I decided to do, post-colonial theories, I don't have to negotiate that. From the get-go, you're getting into hell. And the good thing about that is when students stay, they know what to expect. So that's why I don't really have strategies, to approach difficult conversations, because what I teach is by definition difficult.
Okay, wait.
Say
but
genocide in Rwanda. How do you make it more difficult than that?
I'll push back because you did something with that young man who became a scholar in Oxford. Like he stayed and he fully took on what you were doing. So like you built a relationship with him and did something. So you're doing things.
I did. I guess what I'm trying to say is I shouldn't have to think how to address it.
Sure.
For me, it came pretty naturally,
Mhm.
And just because I know that from that statement that if I was white teaching the same thing, they would feel differently.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's why to me, I don't have to create or design strategies.
Yeah.
It comes naturally, in a sense. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying. I also understand that sometimes that type of teaching takes a toll.
Mhm.
And
Mm.
it is sometimes, I don't know how else to say it. It touches your soul sometimes, and it makes you weary. I don't know a better way of saying it. It can make you very exhausted sometimes because you're giving pieces of yourself away to open a window for someone.
no, it's true. It's very demanding. It takes a toll. And a student asked me yesterday, how do you remain sane teaching this stuff all
Yes,
the time?
exactly.
And I told her, it's just, I'm able to do this because I always think of the self as the other. That's the only way I'm able to do this. I could be comfortable, full professor at SMU. I could be like, what do I care about people in the hood, in the ghetto? But that's why initially I mentioned radical equality, in the sense that if doing post-colonial studies, I believe if I enter this ivory tower, that post-colonial studies try to break down, then I'll be deserving what I'm doing by repeating exactly the same thing. I'm a full professor. I have no risk of being fired for tenure or stuff. And then all of a sudden, I discard myself from those invisible and inaudible people. Then I'm reproducing the same things that I spent my career fighting against, you know. So in my case, it's both intellectual and kind of personal, you know, in terms of trajectory. And I can't just shut up in the face of injustice.
Yes.
Simply, I don't have to make up ways of addressing them. It comes pretty naturally, in a sense.
Well, we've reached the end of our session. It's 2:00. So I want to thank everybody for coming. We can continue to talk a little bit more if the panel wants to, but at this point, it's my duty to say.